What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, and on this episode, we're going to recap Week 1 in the Premier Lacrosse League. We'll recap all 4 games from this past weekend. We'll recap some PLL Player Royale as well. Later on, we'll update the power rankings as we'll do each week throughout the regular season, and then to round it all out, we'll get your thoughts in the mix on Week 1 in Albany. But first, I want to say thanks to Peter from Lacrosse Playground for having me on his PLL Narrative podcast on Saturday night to talk about those games that went on in day 1 and also previewed Sunday's matchups. And that was actually my first time guest appearing on a lacrosse podcast, so that was super fun, and I really enjoyed it. So a great experience for me. So thanks again to Peter. And just to jump right into this episode here in segment 1, recapping this weekend's action in Albany. Like I said, the Whipsnakes in game 1, 9-8 winners over the Chaos. And this was a really physical, kind of grinded out game by both teams, just really battling at both ends of the field. The Chaos jumped out to an early, I believe it was 6-2 lead in that one, and really looked like they came out pretty well. And Matt Rambo, one thing that was interesting was that Rambo went just 1 of 8 shooting in that game, so a bit of an off game for him. Blaze Reardon at the defensive end of the field for the Chaos. As I mentioned last week, the Chaos were going to have Reardon and their full complement of defensive players on that end of the field, and they played really well. I mean, holding a guy like Rambo to 1 of 8 shooting, Jared Newman was matched up with him all game long. That's not an easy task to get a guy like Rambo to go just 1 of 8 shooting, and Blaze went 13 saves in the cage, 59% for the day. That's a pretty solid outing from him. As I said, we can expect that type of a performance from him game in and game out. And the Whipsnakes just won another close game on another clutch goal in the final seconds, which we've become accustomed to seeing from them throughout these last couple of years in the PLL. And that's something that I said, I believe on Thursday's episode, was I wouldn't be surprised if it was another one of those kinds of games where it's just a physical kind of tough it out game, and yet the Whipsnakes find a way somehow in the end to pull it out, as they ended up doing so, as Chanenchuk gets his hat trick on that final goal of the game. The second game on Saturday, the Atlas blow out the Redwoods 17-11. The Atlas offense is the definition of family style of lacrosse, and they really just moved the ball so well. They got so many different guys involved. You talk about Teat and Eric Law, each had 7 points in that game. We'll talk about them a little bit more later on when we get to the power rankings section of our episode. But when you talk about that family style, this is the kind of thing, the unselfishness that this offense plays with. A stat that I saw just before jumping on here in this episode to record from Dan Arestia said the Atlas on Saturday had 13 assists in their game, and the Whipsnakes, Water Dogs, Chaos, and Redwoods combined had 13 assists. So when we talk about that family style, we talk about the unselfishness that those guys play with offensively, getting everybody involved. That is what we are talking about. And I even tweeted out during the game, and one of the cool things was you could see people's tweets popping up on the broadcast on ESPN. So my tweet actually made it on the broadcast of that Atlas game, and I said that this team really embodies that idea that you talk about on the offensive side of the field. When you say one more, you make that extra pass, you find that open guy, and you just move the ball so freely and so unselfishly, and that's what this Atlas offense is able to do, no matter who the 6 guys are out there offensively. I mean, I talked with Peter in the episode on Saturday that I did with him, when he asked me, how do they mix in some of these guys offensively? Did you see them leaving guys like Jake Caraway and Romar Dennis out of that offensive unit on Saturday? And I said that it's probably going to just be one of those things where each week one guy is going to get left off that unit, and they're going to rotate some guys through, see who plays well with who, and really creating that chemistry and seeing where that chemistry comes from. But really, when you look at this Atlas team, it comes from everywhere. It comes from every single player that touches that field offensively, and that's what makes them such a dangerous offense. And then you look at from the Redwoods perspective, I did say I thought Henningberg was going to get that short stick matchup, and I believed he would do well with it, and he did. He went for 4 goals in that game, really holding up that Redwoods offense, because outside of Henningberg, there was not much going on with that Redwoods offense, it seemed like on Saturday, as Miles Jones, Sergio Perkovic, and Nakai Montgomery went just a combined 2 for 13 shooting in that game. Now, Montgomery did have a pretty nice 2-point goal in the final minutes of that game, but for about 99% of that game, I would say, the Atlas defense actually held them under 10 points for the majority of that game, and that's a really tough thing to do, especially with what the Redwoods can run out there offensively. Then on Sunday, the Cannons use a big first half to win over the Water Dogs 16-10. Stephen Kelly started the game absolutely on fire at the stripe, and that's something that I wanted to see from the Cannons going into that game, was how do they come out and battle at the stripe in that game against a guy like Jake Withers. And Kelly absolutely dominated that matchup in the first quarter. I believe they said in that first quarter he won 9 of the first 10 faceoffs for the Cannons in that game. So that's absolutely ridiculous by Stephen Kelly. And really, when you look at that first half for the Cannons, the goals seem to come early and often for that Cannons offense, led by Lyles, 4 goals and 2 assists, as he finished the game with those 4 goals and 2 assists for the day. And I think that defensively for the Water Dogs, they just looked lost in the first half. Like I said, those goals were coming so fast and furious from the Cannons offense. The Water Dogs defense couldn't really do a whole lot to slow them down. And I also think that their offense, trying to push the tempo a bit once they got down by several goals, and they kept trying to get it back, it seemed like all in one play, that also I think compounded the issue for the Water Dogs defense, because you'd finally get a stop, the offense would go down, try to get a quick look maybe 15-20 seconds into the possession clock, they don't convert, and now the Cannons are right back down the other way, trying to push the tempo on that tired Water Dogs defense. So again, I think the offense in that first half didn't really take some of that pressure off their defense a whole lot, but then played better in the second half. But I think that you can't go down 12-3 in a 12-3 hole at the half and expect to come out and win that game in the second half. And like I said, I think we got our answer to what can happen if the Cannons get a few more face-off wins here and there, if they get a few more stops on defense in a game and get that ball to their offense a few more times and get that ball on the cross of Lyle Thompson a few more times. And that, what you saw in that first half on Sunday, was what can happen if they are able to do that. And then the final game, the Chrome knock off the Archers 11-10 in a game that wound up actually being a lot closer than I think it really was when you went and watched that game unfold. And the Chrome were my underdog pick of the week, and they came through for me as I went 3-1 in our picks challenge in week 1. And the Chrome, this was actually interesting. The Chrome never trailed at any point in this game, and their largest lead was 5 when it was 8-3 in the second quarter. And the Archers, I think, offensively looked like a team that were playing guys out of their natural positions offensively. You had a guy like Tom Schreiber down there at attack. He went 0 for 4 shooting at attack. But you also had a guy like Will Manny who definitely had a solid game offensively coming from the box. He had 3 goals and 1 assist for the afternoon for the Archers. But the Chrome were a healthy team, and the defense showed just how tough they can be, holding guys like Schreiber, Trey LeClaire, Matt Moore, and Jeff Traynor to a combined 1 of 14 shooting. I mean, that's absolutely unreal from that Chrome defensive unit. But again, like I said, they showed you just how good they can be really at both ends of the field, but especially on the defensive side of things when they do have everybody there and healthy. Although I do think Chrome fans had to be a little bit nervous there at one point during the game when Jesse Bernhardt was a little bit shaken up on a play, but then going into the timeout that followed, he kind of laughed it off with one of his teammates and looked to be all right. So that was a good thing for the Chrome. And then looking at Player Royale, the PLL Player Royale Fantasy Lacrosse, I thought the overall experience was great. I won against about 8 other people in my challenge that I did this weekend. I scored 89.2 points, which was 24 points higher than the second place finisher in my challenge. So make sure to join in week 2 and we'll have some fun with that. And each week, the players will be reevaluated for tiers based on the previous week's performance. So going into week 2, they'll be reevaluated based on how they scored in week 1. And they'll also be tiered not just on their previous performance, but how they project for that next upcoming week. So however they project going into week 2 will also play a factor in where they are tiered. And you can adjust your lineup every week based on those new tiers of player available. So it'll be interesting because I think that'll lead to having to adjust the way that you value certain players or certain position groups in terms of who you pick and what tier you pick them at. So it'll be interesting to see as the season moves along, as we play Player Royale each and every week. I'll give you my lineups every Thursday on the podcast, but it'll be interesting to see based on those tiers each and every week and who's available at what tier, how some of these lineups shake out each week. And I think that the PLL, just in general, getting involved with fantasy lacrosse in some shape or form was something that needed to happen. And I think as a whole, at least based off that first weekend of seeing it in action, they made it simple yet effective and I think really fun to participate in. And it's something that, like I said, I'm going to do each and every week, and we'll talk about it here on the podcast each week on Thursday. Going into each weekend, and I'll go through my lineup and break it down for you guys each week. And then on Monday's episode, just like we're doing now, we'll sort of recap how things went that week in PLL Player Royale. But coming up in segment 2, as I said, top of the show, we'll get to the updated power rankings here following week 1 in the PLL. Then we'll wrap it all up later on, getting your thoughts in the mix from week 1 in Albany. But you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Welcome back. Segment 2 of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack here following week 1 in PLL action. Get to the power rankings here, the first official regular season power rankings of the season. At number 1, I've got the Atlas, the league's number 1 scoring offense in 2021, came out absolutely hot in 2022 with a league best output of 17 points. Trevor Baptiste went 63% at the stripe and had 3 points, including a 2-bomb off a face-off win. And the Atlas had 8 different goal scorers. We talk about that family style, so 8 different goal scorers in the game for them. And Jules Henningberg had success against their short stick matchup, but the Atlas, I think, did a really nice job of locking down seemingly everybody else in that Redwoods offense. You talk about Miles Jones, Sergio Perkovic, Ryder Garnsey, and Matt Cavanaugh when a combined 2 of 18 in that game against the Atlas defense. So I've got the Atlas number 1 just because of how they came out offensively. And like I said in segment 1, they essentially held that Redwoods offense to under 10 points for about 99% of that game. Number 2, I've got the Cannons. And this could be a possible knee-jerk reaction here, but they showed me everything that I needed to see against the Water Dogs. We talked about being able to compete at the stripe, get a couple stops on defense, get that ball to their offense a little more, and they definitely showed that, especially in that first half against the Water Dogs. And Stephen Kelly, as I said in segment 1, absolutely dominated early on at the stripe against Jake Withers, who finished 56% for the game, did Stephen Kelly. And Lyle did exactly what we know he does. He had 4 goals and 2 assists in that one and just made a lot of really solid plays for that offense. And the Cannons defense, I think, frustrated the Water Dogs, especially in that first half, just surrendering the 3 points in the first half. Although it looked like the Water Dogs were forcing things a bit in the first half because they were down by so much. And that's something that, again, I talked about there, recapping that game in segment 1. And I thought Nick Morocco was absolutely fantastic in the cage with 19 saves, going 66% for the game. And like I said, the Cannons showed me every question that I had going into that game, going into this season. They showed that they are, at least in that matchup, they were a much improved team than what we saw a year ago. Number 3, again, this could be a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but I have the Chrome because this, I think, is what the Chrome are and can be when they're healthy. And Connor Farrell went 61% at the stripe with 11 ground balls, and their attack of Dylan Malloy, Brendan Nichtern, and Colin Heacock combined for 5 goals and 3 assists, while Eli Salama contributed by burying a 2-bomb in that game. The defense, I think, was healthy and absolutely stifled a high-powered Archers offense, even despite the absence of Grant Ament. And really, until the final 5 minutes or so, when the Archers would score 3 of the game's final 4 goals, ultimately losing by 1 to the Chrome, who I thought put together a very strong defensive stand at the end and just a very strong defensive outing as a whole. And that's something that I talked about going into the weekend, was just going up against some of these guys like Eli Salama, like JT Giles Harris, like Mike Manley, etc., etc. And they definitely showed who they can be, especially at that end of the field when they have everybody healthy. Number 4, this one's a little bit different. I have the Chaos here at number 4, even though they did lose that game late to the Whipsnakes. I would actually argue that in some ways they looked better than the Whipsnakes in that game, especially considering their situation on the offensive side of things. You know, I mentioned in segment 1, Blaze had the 13 saves in the cage, going 59% for the day. And the defense forced the Whipsnakes into 0 for 2 into 0 for 2 on the power play. And despite the struggles offensively, the Chaos still had 6 goal scorers, led by Mac O'Keefe with a single and a 2-bomb to his day. And I think once the Chaos gets their offense intact, with those guys coming back from the NLL playoffs, once those are over, once they get that unit intact, they could look to be a potential top 3 team, I think, easily in the PLL this summer. Number 5, I have the Whipsnakes because, as I mentioned with the Chaos at number 4, while the Whips won that game, they didn't look necessarily all that impressive in doing so. The offense did, I think, just enough to win the game, especially behind Mike Chanenchuk's hat trick winner with about 3 seconds to go. But Brad Smith and Matt Rambo, I mentioned Rambo and his game in segment 1, but Brad Smith and Matt Rambo were a combined 1 of 13 in that game, and the defense, I think, looked good. Like I said, that was sort of a physical, grinded out type game, so the defense looked good, albeit against what we would consider to be the Chaos's backup offense, essentially. But I do think that the Whipsnakes have some work to do to get back in to that top 4 next week. Number 6, I've got the Archers. They had no Grant Ament, obviously, at attack, which saw Tom Schreiber go 0 for 4 shooting at attack in his place, leaving Marcus Holman, Will Manny, and rookie Connor DeSimone to essentially carry the offense, it seemed like, combining for 8 goals and 4 assists in that one on Sunday. And I think if the Archers can get Grant Ament back and move everybody else back to their natural position offensively, they can and probably should have a shot at least the top 5, I would say, in these PLL power rankings. Number 7, I have the Redwoods. The Redwoods defense was absolutely shelled by the Atlas offense on Saturday as the Bulls shot 48% for the game and saw 2 of their starting attackmen tally 7 points for the game, combining for 8 goals and 6 assists between Jeff Teat and Eric Law. And I thought Jules Henningberg did succeed against that short stick matchup like I've talked a ton about. He had those 4 goals in the game against the Atlas. But the other top offensive mids, guys like Miles Jones, Sergio Perkovic, and Nakai Montgomery, combined just 2 for 13 shooting, with a 1-point goal from Miles Jones and that late game 2-bomb from Nakai Montgomery. So the Woods are now tied for last in goal differential at -6 after week 1, and the other team tied for last in goal differential at -6 are my 8th and final team in these power rankings, the Water Dogs, in their game against the Cannons. And the dominance by Stephen Kelly showed at the stripe in that first quarter. Like I said, I believe they said he started 9 out of 10 in that game. And the Water Dogs defense allowed the Cannons to shoot 41% in the game, kind of similar to the Redwoods I mentioned, allowing the Atlas to shoot 48% in that game. But the Cannons shot 41% against that Water Dogs defense, albeit without Dylan Ward, but still the defense in that first half didn't provide a ton of support for DeLuca in the cage. And Zach Currier, probably one of the bright spots in that game for the Water Dogs, had an all-around solid game statistically, as we know he can do game in and game out. Had 2 goals, 5 ground balls, and a caused turnover. So I'd love to actually go back and see what kind of point production that was in terms of PLL Player Royale. So that's something that I'll have to go back and check out to see how he did there. And I just think overall for the Water Dogs, they need to clean things up defensively in front of their keeper, no matter who it is going forward, whether it's DeLuca, whether it's Dylan Ward when he comes back in probably about 2 weeks or so. So it'll be interesting to see how they make those sort of adjustments at the defensive end of the field to make sure that they don't have another game like that moving forward. So coming up in segment 3, we'll get your thoughts in the mix on week 1 in the PLL. To wrap it all up here on a Monday, you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Welcome back. Final segment of the show here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. I went on Twitter. As always, my Twitter is at Stevie Mack Media for all show and PLL related content and discussion. So I went on Twitter and got your thoughts on week 1 in the PLL, just sort of your overall thoughts, maybe some things about the games that we saw, talk about ESPN and the broadcasts they did with the games this weekend, etc., etc. So from Coach Shrek on Twitter, he says, number 1, Teeth to Gray connection is alive and lethal. Number 2, Redwoods need to learn to handle pressure on offense. Number 3, a young, healthy Chrome team is dangerous. Number 4, the Water Dogs need Dylan Ward ASAP. And number 5, Lyle gonna Lyle for the Cannons. And he also had one more comment separate from that, which we'll get to in just a minute. But to go through each one of these first few points that Shrek makes, Teeth to Gray connection is alive and lethal. Yeah, that goes back once again to that family style of lacrosse. Doesn't matter what 6 guys you run out there offensively, they're going to get everybody involved, and that goes to that 13 assists that we talked about in segment 1 that they racked up against the Redwoods on Saturday. So yeah, when you have 2 guys that are seen as sort of generational offensive talents like Jeff Teat and Chris Gray in the same offense, it is going to be interesting to see how those guys work together within that offense. And you saw on Saturday, it's going to work pretty darn well for them. Number 2, he says the Redwoods need to learn to handle pressure on offense. Yeah, that's something that I mentioned earlier in this episode with the Redwoods. The Atlas defense, I thought, matched up extremely well with them, especially at attack, with guys like Kavanaugh and Garnsey basically going 0 in that game shooting. Henningberg, yes, did sort of pick apart that short stick matchup at times, but it's one of those things where you'll let him go and get his if you can shut everybody else down within that offense, and that's essentially what the Atlas were able to do against the Redwoods on Saturday. He says a young, healthy Chrome team is dangerous. Yeah, absolutely. I think you saw that especially at the defensive end with what they had in guys like Jesse Bernhardt and JT Giles Harris there coming off basically season-long injuries a year ago. So having those guys back and healthy and contributing to that defense, and Sean Scanoni in the cage, was absolutely huge for them against that Archers offense. Number 4, he says the Water Dogs need Dylan Ward ASAP. I can agree with this to a certain extent. However, I think if you go back and look at that first half and the way the Water Dogs defense played in front of Matt DeLuca, I don't think it entirely mattered who was in the cage in that first half, because they were just getting absolutely blown apart by the Cannons offensively, especially when the Cannons tried pushing the tempo a few times. Just there was it almost seemed like a lack of communication, or guys not fully understanding maybe where they needed to be in certain situations, but there was some sort of defensive breakdown in front of DeLuca in the cage. So yes, I do think that having Dylan Ward would be an upgrade in the cage for sure, but I do have to differ in the fact that the way they played defensively in the first half, I don't think would have made too much of a difference who was in the cage at that point. And then number 5, he says, Lyle gonna Lyle for the Cannons. Yeah, I mean, week 1 comes out, 4 goals, 2 assists, basically looked like he was in mid-season form from the jump, but also when you have a guy like Stephen Kelly dominating in that first half at the stripe, just continually getting that ball to your offense and giving you more opportunities to put up big numbers, then that definitely helps too. But yeah, he definitely looked like a guy who was in mid-season form right away. And then his final comment was more of just a general comment saying that overall broadcast was amazing. Love the ESPN crew working alongside Ryan Boyle. Their passion really comes out on the broadcast. And yeah, I absolutely think that as a broadcaster myself, seeing the product that ESPN put out this weekend, and even going back to when we saw the draft not that long ago on ESPN, the product that they have put together for the PLL, I think is top notch. They definitely look like they're putting that time, that energy, and yes, their money into making it a good product on the air for the viewers and everybody involved, from the fans to the people calling the games, whatever it may be. It was just a really nice product to see on the broadcast. And yeah, I think that the guys that actually called the game this weekend did a really nice job. Obviously, we know what we're getting when you talk about guys like Anish Shiroff, Quint Kesnick, and Paul Carcaterra. I thought Ryan Boyle did a really nice job fitting into that trio who's already used to working together during the college season on ESPN. So I thought that crew did a really nice job. And I also thought Chris Cotter on Sunday did an excellent job jumping in there with Ryan Boyle as well. So just overall, I thought it was a great first week in the PLL. The broadcast was fantastic. The play on the field was fantastic, although some, as we've said, did a little bit better than others. But it is only week 1, so a ton of games yet to be played. A lot of things still to be decided as we move along here this summer. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. You can also find the podcast just about anywhere you get your podcast, including Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn, just to name a few. Just search Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.